Well, as we're getting started, I want to kind of tell you what I was thinking about when I was putting this together. Last year, we did a short series using art and looking at specific works of art, one a week, and thinking about the artist background, the techniques that were used, and then kind of doing some interpretation. I'm not doing that today. Sorry. I'm going to show you a lot of art, but we're going to kind of think about this in a slightly different way. And we're going to think about how the story of Christmas was told and how there were different characters than we might be familiar with in our version of the story. I don't know about you all, but when I was a kid, I had a little nativity scene, kind of like this. Do you all, like a little plastic one that you give your kids so they don't break anything? Like we had a nice one, but we had this play set that was always under the Christmas tree without the manger until Christmas. And we would have the opportunity to make up stories about how the birth of Christ happened. And we used our imagination, and we had a lot of stories about camels traveling great distances over sofas and chairs and ottomans to get to the stable, and we would hide the characters around the room. And this actually is pretty much how this story was told and related, because you have to remember, for much of the time that this story was shared, people could not read the Bible. First of all, most people couldn't read, but there weren't a lot of Bibles either, because the printing press wasn't developed until much later. And so they told this story through art. So we're going to look at the Christmas story, and we're going to look at a particular character that you may not be familiar with. And that character's name is Salome. And the story of Salome is told in the Proto-Evangelion of James. This was a text that was written in the mid-2nd century, around 140 years after the birth of Christ. It's attributed to James, who is believed to be the brother of Christ in some traditions. And this is a long narrative of how Mary deals with the unexpected pregnancy and how Joseph deals with this as well. And it goes on, and it talks about them going to see judges and making their trip to Bethlehem. They don't arrive, spoiler. But this document was the main story. This is the story that everybody knew. So much to the point that in the 5th century, they tried to outlaw it. 2 different popes had decrees saying that this was not in the canon, that this was not part of the story. But for centuries and centuries after that, the story is still told in all of these different works of art. And the main thing about this story that I think is significant, besides the character of Salome, which we'll talk about in a minute, but this is the first story that really emphasizes the virgin birth, that this was not a normal human birth. This was a miraculous birth. And I want to just, before we get too much into it, I want to think about what they're talking about. There's a Greek word called Theotokos. That means God-bearer. This is what Mary is referred to in the Orthodox and Roman Catholic traditions. If you notice, this is an icon of Mary, and you see Jesus sort of fully formed in the womb. This is right after the Annunciation, where she's told that she's going to give birth. She has her hands up in submission, saying, "Here I am." And you notice Jesus is already, giving the peace sign, so to speak, the Christian peace sign. But I want you to think about for a minute, why do you think they made such a point of Mary's miraculous virgin birth? Why is that significant?
It was
God's
God's child.
child,
Absence of sin.
absence of sin,
Old Testament prophecy.
Old Testament prophecy from Isaiah, right? Let me propose one other thought. It's kind of messy. If you've ever seen a birth, it's kind of messy, right? It's not the way that we tell this story. And for these old guys in the church back in the day, the thought of the Son of God coming out of a woman as an infant, completely dependent on that woman, was too much to bear. They just, that was not the way they wanted to tell the story. So they go to great lengths to tell this story of this miraculous birth, to the point that you have this Gospel of James, his birth narrative, that tells really a completely different story than the story that we're familiar with from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. I know this is small, but I'm going to read you, and this goes, it's a little bit long, but bear with me, because I think you'll be surprised at how this story is told. This is from the Gospel of James, which again is a non-canonical gospel that was very, very popular up through about the 5th century. And I'm starting in what scholars have put to be the 18th chapter, although let's keep in mind they didn't really have chapters back then. But it says, "And he found a cave there, brought her to it, and stationed his sons," these are Joseph's sons, "with her, and went to look for a Hebrew midwife in the region of Bethlehem. Now I, Joseph, was wandering but not wandering, and I looked up to the dome of heaven and saw it standing still, and into the sky. And I was astonished to see that even the birds of heaven were still. And I looked at the ground, and I saw a bowl lying there, and workers reclining, and their hands were in the bowl, and they were chewing but not chewing, and they were picking up food but not picking up food, and they were bringing it to their mouths but not bringing it to their mouths. Rather, all their faces were looking up. And I saw sheep being driven, but the sheep stood still, and the shepherd lifted his hands to strike them, but his hand was raised. And I looked into the torrent of the river and saw young goats, and their mouths were in the water, but not drinking. And suddenly everything resumed its course. And look, a woman was coming down from the mountain, and she said to me, 'Man, where are you going?' And I said, 'I am seeking a Hebrew midwife.' And in reply, she said to me, 'Are you from Israel?' And I said to her, 'Yes.' And then she said, 'And who's the one giving birth in the cave?' And I said, 'My betrothed.' And she said, 'She's not your wife?' And I said to her, 'Mary was nurtured in the temple of the Lord, and it was decided by lot that she would be my wife. Yet she's not my wife, but she's conceived from the Holy Spirit.' And the midwife said, 'Really?' And Joseph said to her, 'Come and see.' And the midwife went with him. And they stood in front of the cave, and a bright cloud overshadowed the cave. And the midwife said, 'My soul is magnified today, because my eyes have seen something wonderful. Salvation has been born to Israel.' And immediately the cloud withdrew from the cave, and a great light appeared in the cave, so that their eyes couldn't bear it. And a little later the light withdrew until an infant appeared. And he came and he took the breast of his mother Mary. And the midwife cried out and said, 'How great today is for me that I have seen this new miracle.' And the midwife went out from the cave, and Salome met her. And she said to her, 'Salome, Salome, I have described a new sight to you. A virgin has given birth, which is against her nature.' And Salome said, 'As the Lord my God lives, unless I examine her condition, I won't believe that the virgin has given birth.'" Does that sound familiar to anybody? Thomas, right? And the midwife went in and said, "Mary," now bear with me here, this is going to get a little graphic. "Mary, position yourself, because there's no small test coming concerning you. And Salome examined her, and Salome cried out and said, "Woe, because of my lawlessness and my unbelief, because I have tested the living God, and look, my hand is on fire and falling away from me." And she dropped to her knees before the Lord, saying, "God of my ancestors, remember me, that I have descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Don't make an example of me to the people of Israel, but give me back to the poor. Because you know, Lord, that in your name I've healed people, and I've received my wages from you." And look, an angel of the Lord appeared, saying to her, "Salome, Salome, the Lord of all has heard your prayer. Bring your hand to the child and lift him up, and you'll receive salvation and joy." And Salome joyfully went to the child and lifted him up, saying, "I worship him because a great king has been born to Israel." And immediately Salome was healed, and she left the cave justified. And look, a voice was saying, "Salome, Salome, don't report these wonderful things you've seen until the child comes into Jerusalem." This is the story that most people knew about Jesus' birth back in between 500, well, no, let's go back even further than that, 150 to 200 BC, or AC to probably almost 1500. We'll see some representations of Salome that are from that 16th century. So I want to start by showing you one of the earliest depictions of this scene. This is Salome here, raising her hand to the infant. We have Mary. Joseph is not present in this scene. But what's really interesting about this is this is off of a 5th century sarcophagus that was found in Germany. And this is where some of the oldest representations of the story actually are on these sarcophagi that people were buried in. Why do you think they would have the birth story of Jesus on a coffin, on a sarcophagus? Any thoughts?
Our hope of resurrection and being with God.
Yeah, of that divine birth and all that unfolds from that. Yeah. This is currently in the British Museum. I believe it's on display, so you could actually go see it. It's pretty small. A lot of these pieces are actually fragments from larger pieces because over the years, the pieces have been lost or destroyed. I want to show you another relief sculpture. And by the way, relief, I guess I should say, these are marble reliefs. And relief means to sort of lift out of the stone. So the idea that the artist is trying to convey is that these characters are kind of coming out of the stone that's being carved into. This is a throne from Archbishop Maximianus of Ravenna. And this was done in the 6th century. It's believed to have been carved probably in Greece and then taken to Italy and assembled. And on this throne, there are different pictures of different scenes from Scripture. And you're going to hear this again and again, but if you can't read, how do you tell the story? You tell the story in pictures. So these are all scenes from the Scriptures. But if you look here again, really not in our, Matthew, Luke narratives, but if you look here, again, you see the picture of Salome reaching her hand up now to the Virgin Mary for healing. So they've kind of changed the story a little bit, but you still have this character. You would say, "What? I don't remember a woman besides Mary in that story." Well, that's Salome. That's there. We were talking earlier about Pisa. How many of you have been to Pisa in Italy? Yeah, quite a few. It's remarkable. I, always thought of obviously the tower there that everybody talks about. But what's interesting is that this whole project really took almost 200 years to construct, so several generations. And you can see this kind of evolution of influence that starts in the East with this very Romanesque sort of arches here. And then as it goes up higher, you see all of a sudden the architectural style is totally changed. So you have these little pointy roofs, more of a Western style. And a lot of the architecture in this whole complex is really a fusion between East and Western styles. And you have to remember, like, this is before the church has really officially split. That, you know, we think of it as a hard date, but it wasn't. I mean, it took centuries for these two, Roman Catholic and then the Orthodox churches to really disassociate. So you see this influence of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the bottom here, and then as you rise up, you see more of a Western influence. But in this complex, in this building right here, it's called the Baptistry, and there's this wonderful example of relief carving. It's all across the top here. This is actually the pulpit. And in the Baptistry part, again, you see this picture of the story. And again, Salome, her whole arm is gone in this depiction. And you can also see how they have this basin here. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. But as the story kind of evolves, you go from Salome extending her hand to Christ to Salome to Mary, and then later you'll just see the midwives that are actually just bathing the Christ child. So this was about 1200. Am I telling you right? Oh, yeah. I think it's in the 1200s was when this was carved. Oh, that's a larger picture that you maybe can see a little better. Notice Jesus' head somehow got knocked off or something, so he's headless, but I don't think that was intentional. So this is in Palermo. This is a little still in the 12th century. They have all the stories are told in these big domed vaults in the cathedral. And again, if you can't read the Bible or you don't have a Bible, you're sitting in this cathedral and you're looking at these different paintings and they're telling you the story. And here we see down at the bottom Salome and the other midwife, and Jesus looks like a balding middle-aged man. We have the wise men over here offering, and I'm going to show you another icon in just a second, and we're going to go through all the different stories. But again, this is in Italy, so Western Christianity, but still incorporating this story from the Orthodox tradition from the East, from the Byzantine Empire. So let's look at this. This is a pretty typical icon of this story. And the icon is meant to tell you the whole story in one glance. So you'll see that there's several different depictions of Jesus in this story. We have the angels up here, wise men coming. We have shepherds down there at the bottom. Joseph, who's always depicted as very elderly, sometimes looking away, sometimes this one he's sort of, I don't know, his eyes are looking this way, but his head's looking that way. So, also notice that we're not in a manger in a stable, really. We're in a cave. And that comes from that Gospel of James. And we're going to talk more about that next week because there's this great vision of Margaret, who was a nun, who had even more elaboration on this birth story than the Gospel of James. Notice the star above, going down, pointing right onto Jesus here, and we'll see like different variations of that in a minute. It's interesting that the shepherds are the ones with the gifts, not the three wise men, which is a little different in the way we tell the story as well. And I want you to kind of think, notice down here the little thing. This looks like a font, right? This looks like the font in our sanctuary. So you might think about, well, are they just bathing or are they baptizing? And what does that mean if the midwives are baptizing the Christ child? What would that say to somebody? And if somebody was just looking at this, I mean, what would they think? Would they see that as a baptismal font? Probably. I mean, there's probably a font that looks just like that in the chapel that they're in. So that really sort of elevates the position, I think, of these midwives. This is another icon from Siena. This is a little later, about 100 years later. There's always the ox and the donkey are always in all of these, which, again, not in the story per se that we have in the Bible, but very important in the telling of the story. You'll always see them. Here we have Joseph again in the lower left-hand corner. He's almost always in a lower corner. The angels above. The Christ child looks even more, sort of weird and older. There's also some strange little details here. It's hard to see. You have the dog, and this is a black goat right here. And in all the reading I was doing, nobody really knows what this is, but it's very interesting that the shepherds are depicted as very old in this. And I assume this is a staff. This might be like a skeleton of something. But a very different depiction. Notice again we have the cave instead of a manger. And we have this sort of, Mary is often in these icons, has kind of a cocoon around her. You'll see, like, this is often, it'll turn into like a red overcloak in a few centuries. But at the beginning, this is just where she's reclining, and it's almost always depicted in red. And then her robe is almost always blue, although this one is so dark that it's hard to really see the blue in it. But again, this is how they're telling the story, is by using these icons to be able to show you this story that we just read in some detail from James's Gospel. This is a cathedral. Now we're getting close to the 14th century. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here just because this is such a beautiful example. So here you have all of these depictions actually on the outside of the church, not on the inside of the church, right? So you talk about some good evangelism, like telling the story. It's like right out there, even if you don't go in, you're going to see all the story. And down here are just amazingly detailed relief sculptures like what we saw in the throne of Maximinius. It's also the home of the sacred linen of the miracle Corpus Domini. And I'm going to take a little diversion because I just think this is an interesting story. So there was a priest named Peter of Prague, and he was celebrating Mass in 1453. And you know how they had the little white sheet over the elements for communion? The white sheet over the bread began to bleed. He stopped the service. He was just, as one would. And they went to the Pope. They verified this as a miracle. And it's still enshrined in this cathedral that you can come and see. That's really not the point I was trying to make with this presentation, but I found it interesting. If you go to cathedrals in Europe, there's all sorts of relics like this that, and they're often kind of off to the side. So take a moment and check those things out because there's always very interesting stories behind them. These are some of the relief sculptures that little higher detail that are on the outside of these, out of the cathedral. And the cathedral is called the Golden Lily because of the way that the stone has a more yellow pinkish color, and when the light hits it, it's facing the west. So as the light hits it in the afternoon, the relief sculpture really comes alive, and you get a lot more of the shadow of the figures. They appear to be coming more out of the stone, and because of that stone, it's not marble. I think it's granite, but I'm not sure. But what I want to show you is, of those little pictures, we have this picture here, again with Salome reaching up to Mary. This one is Mary, this one, Mary is kind of looking at the Christ child. And we have Joseph now on the right, but still kind of looking tired. I never figured out why Joseph was tired after all of this, right? I mean, Mary's all serene, and Joseph's like, oh my God, I have so much work to do. This is another depiction that I just wanted to pull out because here we have a little different, like often Mary is looking away from the Christ child. Here we have Mary that's actually sort of taking comfort, I think, as the Christ child is being bathed by Salome and the other midwife. Here, not so much a font, but still, like a jar, maybe a vase container. Oh yeah, the halo on here. It's hard to tell, but the halo is a little different. And does it remind you anything here? A cross, yeah. So you have this foreshadowing in the birth narrative of how the story will unfold. A lot of this artwork, as I said, is not in one piece anymore, and this is actually a reconstruction of what they thought this chapel pieces would have been in the back of the chapel area. Again, telling this story through these scenes on the bottom. And this is all done in tempera paint with egg yolk. Yes? Yeah. Egg white, thank you. You had to beat very fast because it dried very quickly. And it's actually, they put gold flake in it so that, and you can imagine there's no electric lights, right? So this is all illuminated by candlelight. So as the candle's kind of flickering, it's picking up that reflection from the gold in the tempera, really illuminating these scenes. This was done. This took them, I think, like 70 years to put all together. It's a Duccio painting, and here's the sad thing about it. It made it about 75 more years, and then the story kind of went out of vogue. The way they told the story went out of vogue. Because, again, this isn't the way it was in the Bible, in the canonized Gospels that we have. So what do you do when something is out of date? Well, they put it along the side of the church for about another 150 years, kind of out of sight. And then, as they needed money, they slowly sold it off to all these other collectors and museums. This little piece here, which shows the nativity scene, this is actually in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. now. It's very small. Yeah, 43 centimeters square, this little section here. So very small. Again, though, you have the bathing or baptizing of Christ. You have Mary with this kind of red cocoon and then the blue robes. The ox and the ass, always there by the manger. And we have the stars kind of small here, but coming down. Shepherds are over here, listening to what the angels have to say. And this one I like also because you have all these angels that are looking down, like they're like very interested or excited about what's going on. Like they're very curious. They're, most of you have the angels on the back row that are all singing praises, like we've heard in the story. But then you have all these angels here that are just trying to understand what's going on. Joseph is here in the corner again.
It's not so much a cave now.
Yes, that was it. Yes, and now you see that we're back to the manger or to the stable, right, and not the cave. because we have more, the Catholic Church is exerting more influence over the story in the way, because that Gospel of James is not in the canonized scripture. They want to make it more like the story of Luke and Matthew.
I don't want to jump ahead, because you talked about the stable in the cave, but you've been there, and I thought wood was kind of hard to get, and you had to bring it in. That most animals were kept in caves.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the stable in the cave, it's not unusual that she would have been in the cave, because that's where the animals.
Right. But in James's telling the story, they don't even get to Bethlehem. So this is a cave, and if you, I'm going to spoil a little bit from next week probably, but no, it's okay. Bethlehem, there's this whole area around that has lots of caves that shepherds use all the time to protect their sheep from predators. They would be able to bring the sheep into that cave if they saw a wolf, or probably not a lion, but a wolf that would threaten the sheep. And a lot of these caves were actually interconnected, that people had dug through to connect to another one so they could get out, somewhere else where that predator might not be. In the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, there's an area called the Grotto of Christ where, they've sort of brought this idea of Christ being born into a cave. I mean, it's still there because that church is shared by 4 different major denominations, and some of which still hold to this story. So that's something that you can go see. You can go and look at that. And we'll talk more about the cave next week too. The 2 main. These are that's Isaiah and I think this might be one of the gospel writers, but I can't remember off the top of my head. The one on this is Isaiah though, with the scroll. So now this is about almost 100 years further, and there's a lot of differences that have happened. Again, we have now definitely a stable, not a cave. Notice also that the midwives are now dressed very, they're not peasants anymore. This is what like rich people in the 15th century would wear. So they are presented more like nobility rather than peasants. And okay, we'll come back to this next week, but notice that there's not a manger in this scene, that the Christ child is just on the ground, which, if you come back next week, I'll tell you why. How's that? You still have, though, Salome extending her arm down there, and there's a banner right here with words. Now they're starting, it's almost like a comic book where you put in a little bit of words to explain what the picture is. That says, Tegu Purim et Sanabaris, which is touch the child and you will be healed. So they're still, even though they're kind of going more toward our sort of canonical understanding, you have these little snippets, I mean literally like a snippet of text from that Gospel of James that's still in this artwork in the 15th century. So this is, again, in this domed area of the Lorenzo that's the guy's name. This is the Massa Tosta Chapel in Italy. And it shows, this is a little different from some of the other depictions. Again, notice here, Mary is kneeling in front instead of resting. She's actually worshiping the Christ child. We don't have a manger really, we just have the Christ child on the ground. I think these, I don't know if that's supposed to be bedding or maybe glowing rays. And notice here we have the midwives, and she has the linens to help with the birth on her head. So again, we have, and also, this is interesting because this is sort of like going back to, is it a cave or is it a stable? It's got to be like, well, I'm going to do both in this painting so I can satisfy everybody. Anything else?
Is that Joseph then, the gentleman?
Yes, Joseph, like in the story in the Gospel of James, where Joseph is, charged with going to find the midwife and bring her back. So he's bringing the midwives back to Mary who's already given birth at this point. They were late. Or, you know, I think really is the point of the story is that Jesus didn't need a midwife, that this birth was so miraculous and holy that you didn't have all the normal things that you would need help with in birthing a child, that it just, you know, bright light and there he is. If it could only be that easy, right? Here's another one that's very similar in the example. You have the two midwives here, dressed very, you know, fancy, aristocratic kind of garb. The ox and the ass over on the left. Yeah, and she's, you know, extending her hand again, kind of withered looking. And then here we have the shepherds and the angels seen as way up in the top. And again, this is mid-15th century, so you now you have, I mean, this is definitely a stable, right? No sign of a cave, per se. And the angels are much smaller in this one, too. They almost look like little fairies or something. Yeah.
The setting, the landscape is a European architecture.
Yes. That's so. Yeah, as we go into the Renaissance, they're really contemporizing the scene. They're making it look like a scene that one would see in that day. And if you stay for the third class, I think what I'm going to talk about is how we are always putting this story in our context. Because that's where we find meaning, right? That's where it comes alive. It's when we see it in our own context. So I'm sure you've all seen probably stories of like the modern day, you know, family stranded, you know, where are we going to say, you know, miraculous birth. So there's something that is gained by making it something that you would see in your own life. And likewise with the clothing. Obviously, you know, this is not clothing that they would wear at the time that Jesus was born, but clothing that wealthy people would wear at the time that this painting was painted. Another thing to note, and unfortunately I can't tell you who these people are, but quite often when we get to this part, patrons that were sponsoring these painters would ask for their picture, their face, to be put into the story. So, you know, when you saw it, you know, hey, that's Joe. You know, can you imagine if we did that now, right? That, you know. And some of those other ones, yeah.
What's that red thing in the upper right-hand corner? Is that a dragon or a
Yeah.
These are the angels. It's an angel that is telling the shepherds about the birth.
That's a dragon.
You think it's a dragon? Oh, I see. So you would see this as the head, right? Yeah. Her face is right there. But I like the idea of a dragon. And I think this is a good point, actually, that, you know, if you're looking at this, if you're sitting in a church and you're just looking up at one of these little paintings, I mean, you might think it's a dragon, right? I mean, who knows? There's nobody really telling you exactly what anything is. Yeah?
What is it besides Jesus? It looks like a snake.
That is, yeah, I thought it was a snake too. It's actually a cord from her robe.
Okay.
But I think, I think you could read into that, certainly, the presence of evil in the Garden of Eden. Yeah.
But the dimensions of Jesus are really off. It's so little.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those other ones I should have mentioned, if you go back to an image like this, notice how big Mary is compared to the other ones. There was a lot in early paintings and iconography, especially, where the size of the character tells you how important the character is in the story. So in most icons, there is no larger character than Mary. And Mary's often like much, much larger, like totally out of scale. But it's telling the viewer what the importance, what they need to pay attention to. This one's Greek, and so there's more of this kind of Eastern influence. You have this cave that looks almost, I don't know, like a cocoon, a womb, I don't know, something. Mary here, again, you can see how much bigger she is. I love this because the ox is actually licking the Christ child. We have Salome and the other midwife here. And the scene of the wise men here. And you have this interesting little scene here where Joseph seems to be talking to one of the shepherds. And again, it's, maybe this is just to sort of pique your imagination, to try to get you into that story through the artwork. What might they be talking about? What is Joseph saying? What is the shepherd saying to Joseph? Not clear, but definitely like inspiring you to imagine. Yeah.
Did you notice whether the Orthodox art is more true to the ethnicity of Mary and Joseph and everybody in the story? I mean, they're not white. They're not
if you're painting in Greece, you're going to make the skin tones darker, right, than if you're painting in Italy, interestingly. Honestly, I hadn't thought about this, but I imagine that there is a little bit of this, like the paler, by the time you get into the Renaissance, the paler your skin, the more sort of noble you were, because you weren't working outside. It became like the distinction of class, I think, in how you lived as far. But yes, in these Eastern depictions, in most of the Eastern Orthodox iconography, they all have darker skin. Yeah. So this is actually a place that you can visit. It's just south of Jerusalem, outside a national park. I wouldn't go there now, but this is traditionally been viewed as Salome's tomb, and it's been a pilgrimage site since the turn of the millennium. So people have been making pilgrimage to this site for over 1,000 years. And the interesting thing about it is that this is not just a pilgrimage site for Christians. That there is Hebrew and Aramaic writings on the inside of this tomb area. The way these tombs are, it's a cave, and they carve out little niches for the body to lay in a sarcophagus for approximately a year. And then they take that body out, just the bones, and they put it into an ossuary where they collect all the bones. And then the next person in your family would use that again. So this would be used for generations and generations. It wouldn't just be one person's tomb, it would be the family tomb. And in this tomb there was an inscription to Salome. So people assumed, well, that must be, and interesting, not the Salome that we hear about in the Gospels that's at the foot of the cross or at the resurrection in the garden. This is a different Salome, but they decided that this was the Salome that was, in fact, the midwife and not the other one. But I think it speaks to how it's not just Christians that are revering it, but even people in the Islamic tradition are also revering this story of this midwife that they all knew, and so much so that they are making pilgrimages to this cave that's attributed to her. This is a little excerpt I ran across that it's a cute little story, but actually not as good as the Gospel of James. You should read the Gospel of James before you read this. But Irene Zabitoko, pronounce it wrong. Anyway, except for icons or Renaissance paintings and in unpopular non-canonical texts, read Gospel of James, the midwife at the Nativity is not depicted, never remembered or acknowledged, not even in a cheerful Christmas carol. Oh, there are plenty of mentions of cows and donkeys who are supposedly given the gift of speech on that night. Maybe they alone talked about the midwife's role among themselves, but no one else seems to. So I want to end with this, and I think you probably saw that I put this up as for the art for the class, as the little sign for the class. And this is from Cappadocia, which is in northern Turkey. And these are the two midwives here. Definitely, bathing or baptizing, you can take your pick. But I think the thing that I want to leave you with is that the midwives are important to the story because they are helping to bring Christ in the world as regular people, not a divine virgin birth, not the shepherds that just come to acknowledge or the wise men that come to bow down, but the midwives are the ones that are actually caring for the Christ child in all of these depictions. And whether you think that this is a representation of them baptizing or just bathing, whether you think this is, all about Salome asking for healing, the fact of the matter is that this is like the normal person that enters the story, the average person that comes in and is actually caring for Christ in this nativity depiction. And it really got me thinking about how I think it's also a call for us to challenge us to think about how do we care for Christ? Not just at Christmas time, obviously, but are we actively involved in the bringing of Christ into the world? We always talk about, put the Christ back in Christmas. I'm sure you've heard that 100 times. Well, who's going to do that? I mean, it's going to be us, right? It's not by royal decree. It's by us telling the story, not just the nativity story, but the story of how Christ came into our lives, what Christ is doing, the healing, telling that story from our perspective, and the way that they are telling the story from the midwife's perspective is a way that it brings in the common person into this story. And I think that that's lost a little bit in our canonical depictions in Matthew and Luke. So that's why I think this is important. Not that it holds, maybe at the same level of scripture as these canonical versions of the story, but that the story is always evolving. The way people tell it is more about what it means and bringing meaning for those people into the telling of that story. So I think that's the takeaway I want you to have from this class, from this first week, is to think about how you can tell that story of Christ in your life, how Christ has come into your life, to share that with other people. You probably won't make a beautiful icon. If you do, that's great. Come and share it with us on the wall. But you can tell that story in so many different ways. And as we prepare for Christmas again, I want to encourage you to tell that story. If you're sitting with your grandkids and you have a little nativity set with plastic figures, you can tell the story that way. If you're sitting down with an old friend and you think about some way that you've experienced Christ, you can tell, in that way too. But this is what we're charged to do, is to share the story over and over again as people have for centuries and centuries, and to remember that it's not just Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and kings and angels, but it's also common people that are responsible for caring for that child at the beginning of his life. So that's what I have. Are there any questions that you would all think?
Is the Eastern Orthodox Church still here to celebrate with Gospel of Genesis and we see?
Technically, no. But, well, let me put it this way. It's not in the Orthodox canonical scripture. I think that's probably a more accurate way to say it.
That looks like a woman's body with Jesus dead.
I know. I can't speak to, yeah. It's a very odd depiction, for sure. He's not old like some of the other ones, but...
Yeah, and then he's being bathed in like goat's milk.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Again, this is very small and obviously damaged, but yeah, I don't know why it's white. Maybe they didn't have blue paint. Blue paint was probably hard to find.
Expensive, yeah.
there's a little bit of blue. Yeah.
We saw a lot of halos in these art. Do you know what the history is of using a halo?
I've never seen a depiction where there isn't a halo, but it is interesting how the halo changes. And a lot of, like I mentioned a couple of these, and even this one actually, you can see the cross pretty prominently in the figure of the halo. So that I don't know, it's more than just a glow, right? There's some foreshadowing of what that is. That would be a whole, probably a class in itself, it's just look at the evolution of halos. I haven't thought about that, but we can do that. Well, thank you all.